Webinar for you. We're going to be talking with the Jeffris Family Foundation and their director, Royce Yater, and it's going to be a great webinar today. Before we get started, I have a couple messages for you. First off, today we're going to be allowing people to just talk on the phone. If you have any questions with Royce, we're going to be taking questions at the end. But if you'd like to use your telephone to speak rather than having to type your questions in, please call into the number provided on your audio panel. It will say telephone. Just click that and it'll provide you with the number that you need to call to and all the audio pins and stuff that you need to enter for that. And just when you're ready, if you want to talk on the phone, just say, I'd like to talk to Royce and the questions. And when we get around to you, I'll enable you and we can answer your questions that way. And if you don't want to talk on the phone, you can also type in questions as always. A couple things. First, as I said, we're going to be taking questions at the end. Second, if you have any technical difficulties today, please close down the window for the webinar software, click the link that was sent to you, and sign back in, and that will solve 99% of your problems. And same thing goes if you're on the telephone. If your slides aren't moving the way you think they should be, telephone's getting staticky, sound isn't sounding good, just close down the webinar software, and that will take care of most of your problems. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Royce.
Thank you, Devin. I have the privilege of working as a member of the board of directors of a small family foundation based in Janesville, Wisconsin, that has adopted a giving pattern focused on historic preservation project development. And I thought this might be of interest to a good number of people as we're trying to reach out to the larger region, because, as I'll explain, we've expanded our giving area. But the foundation's goal, the mission statement, is written on the screen, and you see it there. Probably one of the few foundations in the nation, not huge, but dedicated to historic preservation funding. So let's roll through this. I'll give you today a kind of history and overview of the foundation's origins and evolution. I'll review the funding categories, what we fund and what we don't fund. I will summarize the criteria that we use in selecting projects for funding, and then share a sampler of projects that we've done over the last 10 years so you get a taste of the kind of work and how that might relate to your community and opportunities that might arise for us to work together. And then we'll leave it open for questions and see what develops from there. So the Jeffris Family Foundation was formed by the Jeffris family in 1979 after the sale of their family business. And for a good number of years, Tom Jeffris, who is the current family principal, his father used the foundation as a giving vehicle in the Janesville area, supporting a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But it was refocused in 1994 when Tom took over from his father on historic preservation in Wisconsin, his particular interest, initially in the state of Wisconsin only. Today, the foundation has grown to the point where our corpus is about $20 million, a little bit over that these days. So we give away 5%. We're required to give away at least 5% by the IRS, so that means we give about $1 million annually to give you a sense of the scale of what we do. The trust was once in partnership with the Midwest Office of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where I was the Midwest director. But when the trust changed its regional office structure, the foundation pulled back and asked me and my co-director, Roman Vetter, to solicit projects, evaluate projects, and administer grants directly, rather than doing a lot of that through the National Trust as we once did. It was about that same time that we expanded some, and I'll show you how that worked too. Because over 10 years, Tom Jeffris had learned that there were certain things that worked well and certain things that didn't in Wisconsin, and he developed a kind of specific focus and strategy that can be quite constraining and difficult for lots of people. So it's important to understand what we do and what we don't do. He acquired that knowledge through the learning curve of kind of trial and error in the early years of the foundation in the late 90s, essentially. But overall, the foundation has given away something approaching $10 million and leveraged something approaching $20 million in by issuing challenge grants, and that's the general strategy of the way we function. We've funded projects of a wide variety of types, and I'll give you a sampling of that, as I said. But what Tom found is that after 10, 15 years of work in Wisconsin, he had a diminishing number of applicants of high-quality projects in Wisconsin. And so in 2009 expanded to include the other 8 Midwestern states that you see listed there, so that he could maintain a highly selective and narrow and tight criteria with strict process expectations. So there are many projects that just don't fit our funding category, and we're not incredibly flexible in that regard. On the other hand, we'd like to think that our process expectations and our criteria actually help projects by encouraging people to follow formulas that have proven successful through our learning curve. Another important thing to understand is that we fund in 2 major funding programs that we've created, but the open bullet that you see here is what we don't do. So if you're facing a project that needs to find a use or needs to be saved or facing an immediate threat, then one needs some sort of intervention grant or advocacy support or preliminary studies to test feasibility of restoration, we do not do that. And we encourage people to focus on state and local sources or national trust sources or state grants. We realize that that's a category of funding that could use a good deal more support, but it's just not our interest. Our focus is on project development of projects that have a viable use strategy and are not immediately threatened. We do, on the other hand, do a good deal of planning grants, but we prefer those to be the terminal or final planning grants that would lead to a restoration project and a capital campaign to support that project. So the first category that we fund in is something we call the Jeffris Heartland Fund, which typically funds 50% one-to-one match for historic structures reports, typically following in the range of 10 to 50K for the grant. That is, $10,000 to $50,000 for the grant would mean a $20,000 to $100,000 study. We've done very few at the upper range there, but we've done the normal ones that we found historic structures report. Excuse me, often in the $30,000 to $40,000 range, and so we end up funding $15,000 to $20,000 is kind of our mid-range there, but we will go as high as $50,000 if it's a particularly critical HSR. We find often that people have pieces of an historic structures report, fragments from various studies, but those may not be current any longer, or they may not be knit together into a cohesive historic structures report. And so very often we fund a kind of consolidation and update of information for sites as well in this Heartland category. If you don't know what an historic structures report is, there's some information on it on our website. There's also a National Park Service publication on that topic. If you just Google historic structures reports, you'll find it. We fund that planning as a pipeline then to our capital campaign challenge grants. And so the typical project that we fund for a capital campaign challenge comes through our Heartland Fund pipeline. They don't have to, on the other hand. I'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. Under the capital campaign challenge grants, that we fund at 33% of an established campaign goal for a specific and discrete project of restoration. And Tom has found through trial and error that this 2-to-1 funding ratio, or matching ratio, is viable for small communities that he likes to fund, but at the same time enough leverage to encourage local support. So I'll say more about how those apply as we look at some projects. First, I think we should understand that what applicants are even eligible for our funding. So the fundamental criteria, of course, is that organizations must be a 501c3 or a qualifying IRS non-taxable entity, that allows us to our gift to be considered a viable contribution to a worthy cause. But it can also be a government agency in partnership with 501c3 organizations. The government, we can fund government agencies directly, but we found that on the capital campaign side that governments are terrible at raising money, but they often work with County Historical Society or some other 501c3 that has a viable track record, even though they may be the owner of, the government may be the owner of record. So either of those kind of categories of ownership and sponsorship of a project are acceptable to us. And then we want to see people who can demonstrate the viability of their project by having completed the early planning studies, identified a viable use, and ready for an historic structure report, or have completed an historic structure report, leading towards a community-centered capital fund drive. Grant conditions, this is sort of ordinary housekeeping. You probably recognize this from a lot of funding sources. Board members cannot serve as consultants. The goods and services should be procured through open competition. That grant recipients should acknowledge our support in printed materials and other exposure to the project. That grant recipients should submit a final report within a specified time frame established by the gift agreement. And that we do, in rare instances, reserve the right to take the money back if the grant funds are being misused and not in compliance with that contract. Now let's focus on the Heartland Fund planning grants for a moment and understand the specific grant conditions that apply there. We formally accept grants for planning studies on February 1st, June 1st, and October 1st of each year. But that deadline is just sort of a motivational deadline because we encourage people to be in communication with us whenever it's convenient for them, whenever they discover us, and to test and explore the viability of the project in advance with one of the directors so that we can guide you in that regard and sort of test the project out. We hate the thought of people filling out applications and sending them off without much hope of success or even knowledge of success. We feel that wastes applicants' time and it also wastes our time. So we'd rather have a phone call or some other kind of contact that would allow us to talk a bit, perhaps review some of the planning you've done to date and see if the fit is going to be there before you spend a bunch of time filling out applications online. I know it's kind of quick and easy these days with electronic mechanisms, but we sort of function the old-fashioned way based on relationships. And our most successful projects have come as a result of those kind of long-term relationships we've developed, a kind of partnership, really, with projects over time. And then, of course, there has to be the capability of matching the grant dollar for dollar on the Heartland Fund. And just be aware that that match can come from any source on a Heartland Fund grant, public or private, and it can be even money you have on hand. And the only thing it doesn't count is the donated materials and services, staff salary, overhead, that sort of thing. The funding expenses that are eligible are primarily consultant services and the related costs of developing the study. We don't fund, under this category, construction activities at all. We don't fund academic research, acquisition of anything, real property or objects. We don't fund surveys or nominations, staff salaries, overhead costs, food and beverage, events, or anything that's incurred prior to our award date. So if you've already raised, if you've already accomplished some things and you want to be funded retroactively for it, you need to go elsewhere. Then if we focus in on the capital campaign challenge grants, which I said typically come from the Heartland pipeline, we extend those invitations, we extend the invitation by letter. And so there is no application form online, there's no application anywhere. and we'll tell you when we invite you what we would expect you to do for us. But by that time, typically we've developed a relationship and know together what needs to be done. If you've completed an historic structures report, or whatever you might call it that meets the expectations of an historic structures report, and are ready to be considered for a capital campaign challenge grant, you can establish a relationship with us at that point as well. We will review that documentation and see if we agree and work together to see if it needs to be augmented, as is not unusual. But we do tend to, just as fair warning, tend to prioritize, if we have to, projects that have come to our own Heartland Fund pipeline first, and then consider other projects as funds are available. Then if we focus on the challenge grants, the grant conditions there is that the applicant must match 2 to 1, again, 33% of the campaign goal. The campaign goal can be for the entire project, it can be for a portion of the project, as long as that portion is a complete and discrete project. So what we don't tend to do is 33% of a roof replacement or 33% of some small fragment of a restoration. We prefer to say we'll do the interiors, or we'll do the exteriors, or we'll do the 3rd floor, or these 8 rooms, or something that's discrete and definable as a completed whole, rather than the stabilization work or maintenance work that might be involved in a project. So again, to understand that and kind of test us out on anything, one needs to develop a relationship with a director and kind of get a feeling through that director of what the foundation would be willing to do. Understand that an important criteria here, an important condition, is that the grants are all or nothing challenge grants. So it isn't like we fund 33% of whatever you raise will match with another 33%. It's not like that. It's an all or nothing. That is, if you don't meet the goal that's set before you buy our challenge grant within a specified time frame, we take the money back. So a cautionary tale is the picture on the right of an art center in Monroe, Wisconsin, small town in southern Wisconsin, that had purchased and was using this E. Townsend Mix historic church as an art center, and they wanted to do a significant expansion, which, by the way, we don't fund, but they also wanted to then restore the church's interior to adapt it more successfully to the performing arts piece and move the visual arts out of the church into the addition. So we, and this was going to be, including the addition, something like a $5 or $6 million project. We made a $1 million grant for the restoration half of the project, and almost $1 million. And they had to raise $2 million within 3 years. The sad thing is that the timing was terrible. That was 2008. The economy tanked, and they failed to meet their goal. And 3 years later, we had to take that money back. They asked for special forgiveness from Tom Jeffris and pleaded that it wasn't their fault the economy went south. No success. Tom was pretty rigid about this. And so understand it is a kind of all or nothing situation. Therefore, we encourage people to be kind of cautious in setting their goals and scoping the project, because in as much as our challenge work, it's better to be conservative and come back to us with multiple phases, as I'll show you, than to overreach and fail. It's bad for you because you failed in the eyes of the community. It's bad for us because we have to then figure out what to do with that money real quickly, or IRS takes it away from us, and that makes Tom Jeffris very unhappy. So just as a point of information on the challenge grants, invitations to apply are extended only once each year in March or April, late March or early April. We expect a draft application in May and then a final by June. These dates can vary slightly each year. We'll prescribe them for those we invite. But because it's once a year, the timing of your campaign needs to be thought, if we're going to be involved, needs to be thought far enough in advance that the two timings fit together, that ours and yours mesh on that time frame. So just be aware of that as you think about our potential involvement with the project. The time frame allowed for the challenge is at the discretion of the applicant, although we do set a 3-year limit on it. So we've had some people that we've issued challenges to who say we want a 1-year time frame because we're going to push this hard, and we think the deadline is the motivator. And by the way, we do see that a lot of the money gets raised in the last year, no matter how long the time frame is. So that motivational effect of the deadline is critical. Some people want a short deadline for that reason. Others want as much time as they can possibly get. So it's up to an applicant as long as it's within the 3 years of our date of award. The match for challenge grants can be cash, securities convertible to cash, or signed pledges payable within 3 years, with the understanding that any pledge must be paid by the completion of construction of the project. So if you think about it, a 3-year pledge signed in the 3rd year could be a kind of 6-year from the date of our award, and that's workable as long as that final payment is made before the project is completed in construction. By the way, we do allow construction to proceed before even our challenge is met. If you feel that you're confident you can do that, just understand that applicants do so at their own risk, and should they fail to meet their challenge, whether you're under construction or not, we take the money back. We've also seen some match in small communities in the form of donated materials and services, as long as they're fair market value that's acceptable to us. More paperwork. There is a 7 to 10 page legally binding agreement that be quite intimidating that we prepare and send to our grantees when we make the award. Again, we don't fund salaries, overhead costs, or any costs associated with fundraising. Now, fundraising consultants or fundraising materials are not eligible for funding as a part of the project cost, nor can count as sources of match under our formula. And the foundation does approve the selection of architects and other consultants, construction managers, anybody in a senior management role. We'd like to see that they have the capability and skills to undertake a project of this type. And that's one of the things I do for the foundation as an experienced historical architect, is to review and approve the documents and the consultants. So let's look at the goals that the foundation has so you can understand that these are really what motivate our priorities. And then we'll go into each of those priorities and our criteria for selection of projects in some detail. But first, the 4 goals are critical to understand here. First of all, as our mission statement implies, we want to support the preservation of history and culture and the unique sense of place in small towns and cities in the Midwest. Tom lives in, grew up in, and still lives in a small town in Wisconsin, and a city of, about 60 or 70,000, I think. And he travels extensively in the Midwest and just enjoys the charm and character and diversity of Midwestern towns and cities. He does feel that major metropolitan areas have a different character and a different access to capital from major foundations that are supported in a lot of those metropolitan areas. He feels that small towns and cities are underserved and chooses to focus there. So it's just his choice that has established that focus on small towns and cities. I'll go into what a small town and city is, or what we think it is, in a minute. We want to develop the most historic sites, the most significant historic sites. And so I'll go into some detail of how we count that. We want to assure quality, restoration, and sustainability through good research and planning. And so that's why we support that, and why we require it, and why we have very narrow, a narrow view on that. But at the same time, we offer, as a part of our partnership, a kind of counsel and advice from experienced leadership on our side of what works and doesn't work. So we like to think that we have tight criteria, but we offer some help, both financial and informational, along the way. And then fourthly, we want to inspire and motivate community leaders and local families to support historic preservation in their communities broadly, the project specifically, both in the capital campaign, thus the challenge grants, but also in the ongoing support of an historic site and the organizations that sponsor and maintain. So with those four goals, let's look at the criteria for award in a very specific sense. In fact, we'll get more detail on each one of these four, but first this little overview. Our four criteria are the historic significance of the site, as we discussed, the viability of the proposed project and plan, the size of the community, and the excellence and track record of the organization that's sponsoring the project and the applicant that comes to us. So let's look at each one of those in some detail. First of all, the significance of the site and the fact that the site must be on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And that we will prioritize projects of national, then state, and occasionally local significance. We did, for a while, try to use the formal documentation of the National Register nomination to determine what was nationally significant, what was state significant, and what was locally significant. We found that because that's such a complicated affair with some of the older designations not including that information, and also the complexities that and burden that places on the State Historic Preservation Office, that we softened our criteria in that regard and basically make our own decision of whether something is nationally or state or local significance. And to some degree, this kind of boils down to what projects kind of light the fire under Tom Jeffris when we talk about it. He is the most important of the three directors. It's his money. It's his family money. And so his opinion counts a lot. So there are things that kind of turn him on, and there are things that don't. And so that's a very important kind of step. But I can tell you right off that he does like the projects of national significance are his favorite, and that regional or state significance would follow that, and that local projects he considers kind of average and tends to want to prioritize elsewhere. He does have a particular interest in architectural merit and the association with recognized designers of importance. Again, prioritize probably national, regional, and statewide. And then thirdly, he has an interest in the decorative arts. And so projects that have strong elements of the decorative arts, there's no coincidence that a lot of our funding, not exclusively of course, but a lot of our funding has gone to projects where we focus on the interior restoration, where the decorative arts issues are intense. He likes projects of extreme rarity, and I'll show you a couple examples of that and the sort of quirkiness that he has a taste for. He prefers projects that have a high degree of historic integrity, that involve little or no reconstruction or replacing elements in whole. Rather, there's enough evidence there to tell us what it was, and we simply put it back in better shape. So historic integrity is important. Historic and architectural integrity is important to him. Although we certainly want to be able to accommodate contemporary usage, and there are cases where we have funded small additions to buildings to support an operational strategy, or replaced an element that was critical to the architecture that was somehow removed in a storm or a fire or something. The second criteria is the viability of the proposed project and plan. So this is just that whole issue of the degree to which the research, documentation, and initiation of the project is professionally managed and academically well-grounded. So we sometimes want to review a feasibility study, a business plan, a master plan, any of that kind of stuff. And then the historic structure report that we fund or that someone else funded is critical. If we're being asked to fund it, we want to know, we want to understand why you think it's critical to your next step in preparing you to undertake a capital campaign. We're also interested in the long-term viability of a project. Tom has seen a lot of well-intentioned local preservationists in small towns who want to save a building, but found that 5 years later that the kind of naive strategy that they approached it with has failed, and the building is back in a deteriorating situation. He would like to encourage people to focus on financially viable, operationally sustainable operations over time. And there's also an issue of the management of the Secretary of the Interior standards, and we do not have the capacity to play kind of design cop in that regard. So we tend to prioritize projects where there's a local historic preservation commission involved or a state historic preservation office that's also overseeing the project, either on a volunteer basis or because there's some other component of the project that has their engagement, or it's under their supervision as a local commission. I have in some cases overseen and reviewed documents in more detail than I do in others that violate this rule, but we will tend to prioritize projects where there's some other supervisory agency overseeing the project. Community size, the third criteria, is essentially inverse. So the smaller, the better. So again, the 8 states are the only areas we fund in. And then we prefer to fund in rural areas, small towns, and small cities, almost in that sequence, with the one criteria, one sort of mitigating factor there, that too rural and too small and too isolated can mean that there's not really a viable campaign strategy can be mounted because there's not a challengeable constituency. So we're always trying to juggle that issue of can a small town like that raise that much money? On the other hand, we love it when they do, and I'll show you some examples that we're very proud of where we think we really helped that happen in very small situations. Our typical grant is outside of a metropolitan area, so we don't fund even a suburban community if it's part of a contiguous metropolitan area. There is one exception to that. I'll tell you a story when we get to the project sampler I'm going to review with you in a moment. And then, because we're always asked, we finally came to the conclusion that we had to define what a small city was. And so we've set it at a population of under 150,000. This is based on Tom's experience in Wisconsin, where he does not fund projects in Milwaukee, Madison, or Green Bay. Green Bay is the smallest of those with a population of 150, just under 150,000 right now. So we've established that as a kind of threshold over which we will not fund. The fourth criteria is organizational excellence. And there again, we just want to be confident that the organization can undertake a community-centered campaign even before we get involved with them on a historic structures report in most cases. At some point in the future, are they going to be able to mount a campaign? So we tend to look for organizations that have a pattern of programming and services connected to their site and the stated mission, some sort of viable operation. We're better off with established organizations than we are with startup organizations, simply because we like to see a little bit of seasoning in place if we can find it. One of the other ways to convince us is to demonstrate a broad base of membership and community support for the organization over time. And of course, any success in past capital fundraising efforts is a sign of confidence for us too. So before I get into the sampler, I wanted to give you a kind of taste of the project types. And this is not by design, this is kind of by coincidence. But it gives you a kind of, it lets you know where our wheelhouse is, but also that we're interested in expanding that wheelhouse when there are opportunities you see that might step outside of these categories. So after 15 years of funding, we've tended to find that our giving works on projects of these types, but as I say, we're open to others. House museums, but we worry about house museums being viable these days. And so increasingly, we're encouraging and looking for house museum settings where some portion of their activity might relate to visitation. But there are plenty of other activities, whether it's some rental of space, some events and activities, rentals, any number of alternative use strategies that relate to museums and maintain the viability of the site over time, simply because of the diminishing visitation patterns we're seeing in so many small town house museums. We have funded and like to fund restoration of public art, fountains, sculptures, that sort of thing, and that people in that category have sort of found us of late, and we're doing more and more of that. Theaters have been a big area for us, and Tom particularly likes them. One, because they tend to be rich in the decorative arts. They tend to be prominent architectural buildings in the community, and sometimes by significant designers. And they tend to be the kind of project that brings a community together for support. It's a kind of an assembly function is always a community function, and so he likes that idea that the project is building the sense of community both in the campaign and in its ongoing use of the property. While he likes the decorative arts, and we focus there a lot, he also has an understanding that there's an industrial heritage to the Midwest that needs to be preserved. And so we've tried to focus some on landmarks that relate to that history of the community and maybe have a particular character, and I'll show you some of those. And then there is a component related to the community development, the kind of ongoing economic viability of the whole community, even when architecturally the project might not be particularly outstanding. So with those categories of activities, not necessarily criteria, but activities where we focus, we are open to other types. We'd love to see people come at us with new and interesting things, as long as the property has some historic or architectural significance, or sometimes a kind of rare and quirky quality. So let me show you some of those. So the story begins with, after the trial and error period of much of the 90s, Tom sort of settled on the challenge grant strategy in the late 90s with a challenge grant to Fairlawn Mansion, a lumber baron's mansion. The Superior's right at the tip of Lake Superior, right near Duluth. This is a house that's owned by the city of Superior, but operated through a nonprofit museums association and under a contract. And that's the sponsoring organization that was raising the funding. The city put in some money, but not huge money, to meet the challenge grant of $600,000 in 1998 and restored the building, particularly focused on some very wonderful Queen Anne interiors that they didn't know they had that had been painted out, that the Historic Structures Report revealed, and that Tom was thrilled to help bring back to life and make this house sing again. This is a house museum. It does have a visitation pattern, but it also is a community center with a lot of events and activities in the small city of Superior. And this became kind of one of the kind of shaping projects that have established our criteria. Another is a project in west central Wisconsin, in Prairie du Chien, which is an aesthetic movement interior house of an really prominent resident. Wonderful decorative arts restoration here. And what's important to understand here is that we put $800,000 against $1.6 million or $7 million in challenges that was raised over 4 phases. So each couple of years they would come back to us for a new challenge and do it in phases. And that's proven to be quite successful in small communities. The community sees progress in pieces and parts, and it keeps bringing people back to the site, and it also makes it, we think, economically viable. So that's proven to be a good and successful formula for us and for sites as well. Another one in the house museum category would be Yawkey House, another lumber baron's mansion in north central Wisconsin, Wausau. Nice little community, handsome colonial revival house. $1 million grant. This is the largest grant we've ever made. And interestingly in this case, because there was concern on our part as we talked about this project moving to a capital grant, we were concerned about a grant of that size, and so to convince us, they went out and talked to a lot of people in the community and kind of had informal commitments from a number of other major donors, and Wausau's an insurance town. They've got a nice grant from an insurance company there. and lined up a significant amount of money without taking a nickel or signing a single pledge, because to meet our challenge, the money must all be raised after our challenge is made formal, typically around mid-year. So when we finally did that in 2005 and agreed to a $1 million grant, they were able to match that $2 million that they had to raise. They had that accomplished pretty much within 6 months, and certainly within a year, had formally met their challenge. And so this is not an uncommon situation. We now encourage people to, you can't raise money that meets our challenge until we make the challenge in place, have the challenge in place. But then on the other hand, you certainly can go out and talk to people and see if you can motivate them. And sometimes we are the motivating point. It's the old, if we could get a grant from the Jeffris Foundation that would challenge us, would you be willing to step forward and be a major donor? You can have that kind of conversation. Just don't sign anything or take any cash. Another house museum, but this is a sort of separate category that's not uncommon around the Midwest, is lighthouses. We've done a couple of projects with lighthouses. So there are other forms of house, I guess you would say, than the classic wealthy individual that we have funded. This is a current challenge grant in Door County, which is a resort area of northeastern Wisconsin. This challenge grant will come due. They have to have this met by July of this year, and I think are not real close at this point, so they're in crunch time right now trying to meet this challenge. The common arrangement is a grant that we made in Traverse City, Michigan in 2009 for a $36,000 storage structures report. We funded half of that. They're now coming back to us for an application and expect to be invited. Sorry, we were just invited to apply. They haven't gotten a letter yet, but we just made the decision to invite them to apply for a challenge grant this year. And I think that's going to be in the $200,000 range to restore this settlement era house in that region. Another settlement era project is an early settlement village in western Missouri, little village of Arrow Rock. This is a town that has a population of about 100 in the winter. In the summer, it booms to, I think, 300. But it also has a steady stream of visitors from the Kansas City area and Columbia and all over the state, really, because it's a rather pristine little settlement village that has all its original charm. They applied to us for a challenge for an historic structures report, which we funded, a $50,000 study on 5 small buildings. We funded half that. And then they came back to us with a proposal for a challenge grant when they were invited in 2012 to undertake restoration of 4 of those 5 buildings. And so we funded a $233,000 challenge grant. They have to raise $460,000 by 2015. The smallest project, the smallest building we've ever done is this one-cell jail in Florence, Wisconsin, far northern, kind of remote Wisconsin. We typically don't fund projects this small. A challenge grant's that small. Tom feels that the paperwork and the hassles of something in, under $25,000 as a challenge grant hardly seems worthwhile. That could be done without our challenge, but in this case, he was intrigued by the very remote nature and very small size of the community, but also, I have to admit, the cuteness of this jail, which is a kind of miniature replica of a courthouse, which looks just like it, sitting right behind where this photograph was taken. Another current project with a challenge grant from 2012 is the Lou Wallace Studio in Crawfordsville, Indiana, a small town about, I think, 6,000 people, about a few miles west of Indianapolis. And here again, we funded a historic structures report that revealed some decorative arts work inside that had been painted over. They have funded the exterior and come back to us, and then came back to us for the exterior, for the interior restoration work. a challenge that is going very well right now. And anybody want to blurt out why Lou Wallace is an important figure? Anybody know the connection there? No speakers? Lou Wallace was the author of Ben-Hur, and it turns out a famous classical scholar who had also been a general in the Civil War, and fascinating character, built this cute little studio for himself in his estate in Crawford. In a small Greek revival house connected to the Underground Railroad, thus its significance in this case. Tebow House County Historical Society approached us for a historic structures report, and then came back to us for a challenge grant. An art center in Springfield, Missouri owns the Edwards home, which is supposedly where Abraham Lincoln wooed Mary Todd on the couch there. Don't ask about the details. The house is now part of a larger complex of arts instruction and galleries and used primarily for receptions. But the interiors have been poorly restored in the 1960s and are now pretty threadbare, and so they're being re-restored under a current program that again began with the Historic Structures Report and then a challenge grant issued in 2012. And this is the Black Hawk statue near Oregon, Illinois, actually in a state park owned by the state. And we worked with a local foundation that provided leadership for the Capitol campaign. And frankly, had the money lined up by the time they got our campaign in 2013 and have already met that. I'm sorry, they got the campaign in 2012. This is a typo. They got the challenge in 2012, and they have already met the challenge in 2013. So this is a case where a government project, government-owned project, and again in that public art category. And a significant number of opera houses and movie theaters. Stoughton, Wisconsin was one of our earliest. We did not do the Historic Structures Report here, but did the challenge grant in the late 90s. And this is where Tom really came to fall in love with theater projects. This is great. It's owned by the city of Stoughton. And in this case, Stoughton was the mover and shaker and did manage to meet the match. But there was also some struggle with that whole issue of people making donations to the government. So we learned to work with nonprofit partners as a better approach, where it's city-owned. Another Wisconsin theater in western Wisconsin. This project had an exterior that was funded under a different source, and then used tax credits for a portion of the restoration. We funded primarily the decorative arts interiors work here, handsome little building, under a challenge grant. And a current project, similarly with a number of other pieces, $5 and $6 million project, where we're funding a discrete portion of it focused on the Opera House itself, a $200,000 challenge grant in Delphi, Indiana, beginning again with the Historic Structures Report in 2009. And a project that's going very well, again, I think $3.5 million overall. We're focused on the theater restoration, primarily the interior. Again, the Historic Structures Report followed by a challenge grant issued last year. And another complex in in Viroqua, Wisconsin, the Temple Theater was funded in 2 phases. Again, they came to us for major work. They left out some pieces that they weren't sure they could make a match on. When they were successful in short order, came back to us and asked for another challenge grant a couple years later. And that was also the case in Greenfield, Iowa. Again, a much larger complex, $5 or $6 million project funded with a number of sources. We focused on the Opera House itself, and then they came back and asked us if we do the decorative arts on another portion of the historic block here. We have done in this community development category a couple of projects involving Main Street organizations in Wisconsin so far. So here's a cute little building in a town of 600,000, central Wisconsin. I'm sorry, 600 people where the Main Street organization is kind of a volunteer, partially staffed organization. But they wanted to restore this old firehouse. They had to rebuild the tower, which was done from historic photographs because that was completely gone. But turned it into their offices on the main level in a kind of community meeting center upstairs. And it's been a very successful project, very stable contribution by the Main Street organization to maintain the viability of this little town and restore this building. We'd love to see more. We would encourage more work with Main Street organizations. We're surprised that we haven't seen more. Another community development success story is the Potosi Brewery, which was kind of the ruins of a brewery that was closed in the 1930s in a small town in southwestern Wisconsin, not far from the Mississippi River. And the project was slowly brought back. I think this was a $4 to $5 million project overall. We funded $400,000 of that, particularly focused on the brew house, the center tall portion, which contains a museum of Breweriana, actually the National Museum of Breweriana, and a set of exhibits on transportation on the Mississippi River. But it also has, to the left, you see what is now a restaurant and pub, brew pub, that serves on-tap Potosi beer. And they're also now bottling Potosi and distributing it throughout the Midwest. So this is a kind of success story for a community of, I think, 800 or 900 people. This has become kind of the hub of the community. Nothing better than a beer hall. Another interesting story is the Whiting Community Center in Whiting, Indiana. Whiting is the home of Standard Oil of Indiana, where the Rockefeller family built this building for the community in the 1920s. It served as a YMCA-like building, community center for a good number of years, but it really needs some serious restoration work. They're currently in an active campaign to raise that funding. This is a case where Whiting is actually in the Chicago metropolitan area, but because it's technically in the state of Indiana, the Chicago foundations tend to think of it as not theirs, and so Indiana organizations think of it as part of Chicago, and so we agreed to step outside of our norm and help fund this project. And the small town of Chase in Wisconsin, this is actually a developing community that wants to maintain the rural character to preserve a stone barn as a park shelter for a county park. And Fishtown is a unique area. We're very interested in waterfronts around the Midwest. Here's a working fish waterfront with restored shacks that, again, a challenge grant followed by, a HSR grant followed by a challenge grant. And a quirky project, a head frame from a mine, very small grant, but just really kind of a piece of rural sculpture. And the most fascinating project is the Pullman fish car, the Badger II, which has been restored. These cars once plied Wisconsin's rails before roads were common in the early 1900s, and dropped fish, fingerlings, into the lakes to stock them. And the fish traveled in pretty high style with a wonderful Pullman interior. And we've done a couple of water tower or landmark kind of projects. This one, again, in 2 phases in the small town of Fort Atkinson. So to summarize, if you're interested in talking with us, send in the initial inquiry form on our website and or contact a director. If you send in the inquiry, we'll call you. If you want to just make direct contact, our emails and phone numbers are on the website. There are also specific states that each of us handle those initial inquiries with. I tend to provide technical services over the whole region, and then I also handle some states in the western part of our region. Roman Vetter is the person who is officially the contact person for Ohio, so feel free to reach out to him if you like directly. And then recognize that our application deadlines, you should be well in advance in that contact of a deadline on February, June, or October 1. And then the challenge grants come through referrals or this kind of outreach or our own pipeline. So come to a director and explain your project and inquire. I get a lot of these calls every week and try to understand enough to see if they can fit into our category. But it takes some time to develop that relationship. So again, don't wait till March to talk to us. You need to be talking to us as soon as possible, and we'll see if we can find a time. If the project fits our criteria and the timing can work to your timing, then we can perhaps develop a relationship that can work together. Again, the contact information is here. Roman Vetter at the bottom is the person assigned to initial contacts in Ohio. But if because of this conversation you'd rather talk to me, feel free to start there too. It doesn't matter much. Or with just initial inquiry on the form, and Roman will get back to you. So with that, I'm open for questions, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Royce. And just in case anyone has to go back to work soon, since the hour is approaching, please send in your questions now, and I will be sending out the recording of the webinar soon. So if you have a question, you can't wait for the answer, just listen later to the answer, and hopefully that'll help you, and also you can contact Royce as well. But now we're going to take some questions, so please start sending them in. If you happen to want to talk on the telephone, just send me in the chat box a message saying I'd like to talk on the phone if you're already connected, and I'll take care of that. If you want to type it out, do that as well. And once again, thanks, Royce, for doing this today. While we're waiting for questions, I have a few announcements. First off, this presentation was made possible in part through an AmeriCorps grant fund through Serve Ohio, Ohio's Commission on Service and Volunteerism, and the Corporation for National Community Service. We have a few events coming up, and I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly. We have 2 webinars coming up on the 24th of this month. I believe it's a Tuesday, 1 o'clock as normal. And we'll be talking with the Ohio Development Services Agency and discussing some of the new grant opportunities that have applications due soon. And also on May 1st, 1 o'clock again, we're going to be discussing Special Improvement Districts, SIDS, with the Cleveland Downtown Alliance. And finally, our registration is open for our annual conference. This year we're going to be in Columbus, Ohio, May 22nd and 23rd. And you can find more information about that on our website, which is www.heritageohio.org. Okay, we have a few questions right now. And Pat, I'm going to modify your question a little bit just to help some people out. So in Mount Vernon, Ohio, there's a very well done so far opera house that's coming into being restored, and Pat is asking about how to contact you guys about that, and also I'm going to modify it a little bit and say what materials should they get together before they contact either you or Roman for an invitation for a challenge grant for that property.
Well, the first the contact point is, as you just cited, probably Roman or I, but what you need to have together is a kind of compilation of the studies. The first questions we'll ask is where are you in the process, and what documentation are you following in is guiding your planning? So we're going to want to review that. So if you could have, you have to be able to, what's really handy is to have all of that in an electronic form that can be shared through a Dropbox site, or we sometimes get a disk in the mail that contains copies of all those studies. At the very initial contact, I try to just summarize what those studies are, what you've done, and what you haven't yet done if you feel that there's something missing. So I'd start with a compilation of what you've got, and then get the copies ready to be able to send off to us if the initial conversation suggests that that's appropriate.
Thanks, Royce. Somebody's asking if you can go back one slide to the contact information and to show them again. Thanks, Royce. Molly's asking a question. Molly is saying, just to clarify, can a city agency apply for the grants independently of an additional 501c3 organization, or do they have to be working in partnership on the project?
The city can actually apply. That's legally acceptable to us. The only reason that we require the 501c3, or would like to see the 501c3, is, again, if it's going to head towards a capital campaign, we found that local governments are not necessarily good at driving campaigns. That requires a kind of community activity that governments haven't proven to be very effective at. So we would like to see that there is a 501c3 involved. But from a formal legal point of view, we can make our grant directly to a community, to a governmental entity if that's what's necessary.
Thanks, Royce. Diane, I sent you a response back on your first question, but Diane's also asking, are funds available for the HSR? Do you have to be from a city with a population under 150,000 to get those?
Yes. Our upper limit on community size is 150,000. The one thing that's often asked is the 150,000 absolute? I mean, we've had people say to us, okay, our population is 151,000. This is a kind of a slippery slope that we're unsure ourselves how to deal with. So there is some room for judgment in that regard if it's close. But I would say there's also the question of population edges. In other, are we talking the 150,000 in a small metropolitan area, which might involve a couple of communities, or are we talking the specific municipality and its immediate population? That's always another question. County versus city population, that sort of thing. So there is some judgment to it. So we're not wanting to be cruel about this. I think we simply want people to understand that we don't want to waste our time and your time discussing projects that are way over our consideration limit. So use 150,000 as an immediate population for a city, particularly outside of a major metropolitan statistical area.
Thanks, Royce. If anyone has any other questions, please send them in now. I'm going to turn it over to Royce for any final comments.
Well, I know that in doing this kind of thing in previous conversations, it's not uncommon that people want to ask things about their specific project. Would my project qualify? What about this? What about that? And I would encourage people to feel free to reach out and send us that initial inquiry. Contact one of the people on your screen and ask the question directly, because we'll sit and chat with you for a while if we can understand what you got. And even if it's just the first conversation and then you compile the material that I spoke of a minute ago and send it along, that's perfectly fine with us. So we're willing to listen and chat a little bit. Just recognize that we do have a specific criteria, and if we feel it isn't going to work, we'd rather be honest with you right now and say so you don't waste your time beating on our door than to lead you along. So test it out and see if we can find a fit between your community, your project's goals, and ours.
Thanks, Royce. And thanks again to Royce and the Jeffris Foundation today for agreeing to do this webinar. I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so we're going to wrap up the webinar. I will be sending everyone a link to the recording and an additional copy of the presentation if you didn't get that before. So look for those in the next few days. Just give me a couple days to make some edits and so forth. Next webinar coming up is Tuesday, May 24th. Thank you all and have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.